and we're recording. Welcome, everybody, to the latest edition of the Scholar Gypsies. I am absolutely delighted to be talking to Paddy O'Gorman today. Paddy, many of you will be familiar with his recent work on what's been going on down in Limerick prison in relation to Barbie Kardashian, but also in the wider transgender kind of conversation that and issues that have been cropping up in Ireland over the last 3 or 4 years. Paddy started his career in RTE. He's over 40 years experience with that organisation, and we'll get into that as we go on. But I suppose what many people today would know Paddy for is his series of podcasts called Paddy's Podcasts. There'll be a link in the des- description to check out Paddy's work. First question I have relates to the trial last Friday in Limerick involving Barbie Kardashian, and he basically was up on three charges surrounding threatening to kill, threatening to sexually assault a female prison officer and also a female um, prisoner in Limerick
That's
prison.
right.
He was acquitted on all charges, and I suppose maybe take us through the day and your thoughts on it.
Yes, the trial opened last Monday. It went on for the week. It came to an end there on Friday. We'd heard earlier in the week from the two alleged victims, the prisoner and also the prison officer. And we'd heard from other prison officers as well about the behavior of this prisoner, Barbie Kardashian. And then it was on Friday, defense called the man himself, Kardashian. And it was a deeply shocking day. I sat in the court last Friday morning. One of the great things about free travel is I was able to go up and down. I live in Dublin, but I'm up and down on the train, no bother to me. I think it's nice to do it that way. But I went into the court on Friday morning, and I say defense called him, and that took me by surprise. And he came up and he spoke with this very squeaky, effeminate voice. A couple of times he had to be asked to speak up. And rather unremarkable with defense, just saying that, he didn't mean, he knew that the women knew that his threats weren't for real. And that was his defense. And that was the basis of the defense. And I think that was ultimately what was the successful defense. But in the course of giving that defense, once prosecution, John O'Sullivan spoke to him and said, look, what did you say to these women? He didn't have to drag it out of him. The guy, he spoke and then some. The fake female voice dropped while he was up there he seemed to forget to do this tiny little faint voice. And it was deeply shocking. He said, yes, I did threaten them. I wanted to threaten them with rape. I'm a woman, he says. I mean, it's even appalling to go through with your podcast now. I thought I would like to use some kind of electrical device to torture them with, without the handle of a mop. I mean, it was deeply shocking stuff. And the guy, it was, I was looking over at the jury and I thought, wow, do they feel, I mean, I was feeling actually quite ill after a while listening to all of this. And defense said, oh, yeah, so you did in terms of, well, what I wanted to do was humiliate them. And it was all to do with the fact that in the case of the prison officer, that she had had a row with him over a yogurt that he had taken. And, well, I wanted to humiliate her because she'd upset me and made me upset. And then with the case of the prisoner, she had accused him, maybe wrongly for all I know, of having left the shower in an unclean state. And of course, once again, and he didn't speak in an angry voice. He spoke as if all reasonable people would think this detailed sexual assault that he threatened them with would be what a reasonable reaction would be. And I was quite shaken. Now, the defense made the prosecution made his closing remarks then to the jury. Defense made closing remarks. There was the lunch break, came back after lunch, and the judge addressed, I suppose, usual to the jury what they had to consider. And I left, and I was back on the train in Dublin when I got the text saying that he was innocent on all counts. And I was startled Now, that's what the jury found. Perhaps the basis of it was, as was explained by the judge in law, this charge to stick. It's not good enough. If I make a threat to you, Jerry, say, I'm going to kill you, it's not good enough for me if I'm charged with that. Say, oh, but I never meant it. No, that's not a defense. The defense has to be that the charge could not have been believed by you, was not credible to you. You see, that's the way that the law actually is. Made a threat that would seem credible. So I presume the jury must have felt, well, those women, the two victims, knew that it wasn't a credible threat, which was his defense. Look, I'm locked up. I couldn't do this. But God damn it, Ireland's small enough. Prison officers live among us. And so there was no particular penalty for this appalling sexual abuse, sexualized abuse, verbal abuse that he subjected them to. And I'm looking, you take the prison officer. She's a working class woman, has to do her job. People should be allowed to do their job without having to listen to this appalling, shocking abuse. The case of the prisoner, obviously she's stuck in there. And again, there's whatever people get punished for. But I mean, I'm old enough to believe in what we call the Mandela principles, which is that when you're sent to prison, you're sent there for incarceration, not for later torment when you're put there. The women in there have been subjected to this torment. Now, I was shocked at this, and it's 2 years ago now to make a podcast. Now, I'd retired from RTE, and I had canvassed RTE with the idea. They're saying, look, it's really very, very simple. Do the same technique I always did with, I find the vox pop is powerful. Stand somewhere for a day. So I said, it's just a story there. And I actually contacted at least one old colleague in RTE who I think is good at that kind of thing, and said to him, just go there, stand outside Limerick prison for the day. That story is there for the taking. So I went down and I stood outside for the day myself. The story was there for the taking because you'll always get visitors who know what's going on. You'll get people signing on who have, in other words, they've got the last, say, 3 months of their sentence. They're allowed out on temporary release on condition that they come back once a week, sign on, show that you're still, staying away from what if it would be drugs or whatever. But it's quite common. You get people on TR or temporary release, And of course, you'll get ex-prisoners as well who are back visiting. So you learn a lot. Whether I've done that in Crumlin Road, Belfast, in Cork City, in Limerick, in Dublin. Stand outside and you learn a lot about what's going on. You really do. So I stood outside and I started meeting women who'd been in there, and it was a consistent story. There was Leanne Casey who stood over, she said to me to give her name, and she talked about, and actually, at the time, I didn't broadcast it all or publish it all because she made certain allegations saying sexualized assault or rape threats, which I couldn't make stand up. Now, actually, when I revised that, I am going to put that there because the man stood there and did say I wanted to shove things into women and all. I can't believe this, Jerry. That this is what happened. There was another lady from County Clare. She'd been in there. She was visiting, but she'd been in there for a week, remanded age 20. Like so many homeless people, she had had a rotten start in life. Her mom and dad had died young through drug abuse. She was, as she said, tapping on the streets of Limerick when she was in there sweeping the landing when she hears this talk coming out of the doorway at her. And I found it very useful to be in that prison there last week because a lot of stuff that my critics have denied, I had it from the horse's mouth that it does happen. There was 2 sisters there who'd spent some time in, 2 traveller girls, and they said they knew these men were looking out at them when they were out, and sure enough, I heard Barbie Kardashian saying there last Friday, oh, but I could see out through the window in my cell. Now, I had so many people the last 2 years telling me I was lying or that these women were lying. These women were not lying. That is what happens. Now, when Leanne was there was 3 of them. There was Barbie, there was Shauna, who was not a sex offender. He was in there for 3 violent assaults, which landed him in prison, a Dublin man. And there was the one we can't name because he's a paedophile. But I heard his name. Interesting. Again, where were they? And this was by January last year, which was some time after Barbie had been in there. Now, where were those men put? Shauna Kavanagh was out by then, the guy who's not the sex offender. He was out by January, I think. January last year, he was already out. He was out nearly a year at that stage. But the other 2, It was described E-wing, Echo wing on the landing. There's E1 is where Tegan McGee, and another female, a genuine female prisoner were in there. Okay, we knew that. Next door in E2 is Barbie Kardashian. Next door in E3, and the name was given again, another woman's name, but I know damn well who that is. That's that paedophile. Now, he's a most appalling man. He got locked up, and our newspapers told us about this woman who'd been abusing a child. This woman who told this little boy that she'd pull his arms out if he said anything about what happened to him. And our craven newspapers, our journalists reported this as a female assault. Just to finish on the line, when Kavanagh got let out in January of 2022, now he'd done, I don't know, he'd got, I think, 2 years, he'd had a suspended, part of it was suspended, but he'd done many, many months in there. He started off in the Docus, then he got let out. Back to Dublin. Where did Dublin City Council put him? And I'm telling you, Jerry, this is a scandal. They put him into a women's domestic violence refuge in Rathmines. And what do you think happened? Within 3 months, the bloody inevitable happened. He beat up a woman there. Now, the women in the podcast, my podcast, I only heard about that some months later. Again, you'd never know it from our journalists. I was standing at Cumberland Street Dole office. Again, just stand there, social welfare office. That's where people first get sent when they leave prison. It's one of the many functions. It's also where we have all the asylum seekers and so on, all piled onto each other, just to that north in the city place. It's always welcome, and you learn so much. But a woman was there, and she had a little plastic bag, a lovely, articulate woman, a most charming woman, young woman. And I knew the plastic bag. She's just out of prison, because that's where. And I introduced myself, and she spoke. And I didn't know anything about the homeless experience of Rathmines, but she talked as people often do. She said how much prison had helped her. She was resolved to stay off drugs now. Very, very positive, as people often are, which I find they are. But then she said, well, if you're in trouble, they send you to Limerick. And I said, oh, yeah, so the bad girls go to Limerick. And then I asked her, do you know, I said they have transgender men down there. And she said to me, we had one in Rathmines in the homeless hostel. And he beat up a 60-year-old woman of slight stature. And what did he get? He got a suspended sentence there last September. Now, I thought about the contrast of that just a month earlier in Limerick, there was a woman, we all know her name, Natasha O'Brien, who got beaten up by a man, Crotty. We all know her name. Why? He got a suspended sentence. He had no previous convictions, and the judge said, whatever. Now, I'm not saying if the judge was right or wrong, but that's what happened, and there was public outrage, and the National Women's Council took it up. All the rest of it, she got to address the Dáil, she got to be commended by the Taoiseach. 1 month earlier, a 60-year-old woman was beaten up by a fellow with plenty of previous, and he also got a suspended sentence there, September last year, 3 months suspended sentence. Not only was there no outrage, our newspapers, insofar as they reported it as a woman-on-woman attack in a hostel. So that's a dog bites man story. The real story, if journalists only had their self-respect in this country, the real story was a violent man got housed in a women's domestic violence refuge where he beat up a woman. And we don't even, sorry, I don't understand what has been going on here. You know, funny. Oh God, I was talking to my friend Stella O'Malley. She said to me when I wrote on this, she said she loved my polite anger. That's what I'm talking to you.
You've packed
so polite. You know?
You've packed a lot in there now, Paddy.
Yes,
And
I have.
There's one or two things I want to pull out of what you've just said there. But one is going back to Barbie Kardashian and this idea of, you know, what he said. You know, there needed to be intent, you know, or, you know, proof
yes,
that
that's right.
he would say. What was Barbie Kardashian in prison for?
Oh, the particular one he's in now. No, he's been in prison. It was threats against his mother, and
so he has a history. He has a history of threats and violence towards
I think
people.
possibly the jury may or may not have known anything about his history. As far as they're not supposed to know anything about him. But the two victims of his verbal abuse know very well he is capable of violent assault.
And the judge knows that as well.
Yes, that's true. I don't know. Look, I'm not going to fault the judge. I'm not going to fault the jury, you know. But
yeah. No, I was just like,
you know?
one of the,
yeah. So
Now, one of the
what he's in
points.
for was against his mother, and it was highly sexualized, detailed just threats of how he was going to kill his mother slowly and sadistically. And this is what I mean, it really would keep you awake at night. And I'll tell you, one of the things that struck me the worst about when they put Barbie Kardashian into a women's prison, I thought the one thing this guy has always had in his fantasy violence and his real violence, it's been against women. But prosecution put this to him last Friday, said it's all against women. And he said in his defense, no, I've made threats of sexual assaults against men too in the last year, as if this was a boast, and he was chillingly matter of fact. But like, that's where he is. And can I just say about the three of them, Kardashian, he who can't be named, the woman who abused the child, and I approve that we don't name him to protect the identity of the victim. And the third one, Kavanaugh. One thing all three of them had in common was they were men when they were arrested. They were men when they were charged. By the time they were being sentenced, they'd turned into women, and we'd given them all three cases. What kind of a joke is it that we can do this, that these men's feelings and wishes can and like then he gets put in. I'm so glad that, so in a way I think it was so useful to learn as much. I found it so very useful that nobody can ever tell me again those women couldn't be heard. We had Kardashian saying yes, he could see the women as they were going by outside. Yes, he was able to shout in the doors, whatever. So I mean, nobody please tell me again that they didn't have contact. Now, I think I don't exactly know where he is now. I shall go to Limerick prison probably on Wednesday of this week to stand outside, and I'll talk and I will learn where he is now, if I can manage it this week. But I've learned that all of that verbal communication is there. And you ask any woman who's had to live with a violent man, he doesn't actually have to be able to hit you. Okay, Kardashian was unlikely to be able to get out and beat them up. But women are living in the same building as him. And as another lady, the County Clare lady, said to me, a lady doesn't have such big muscles as a man has, as she put it to me. And I know if a man gets out, she also said an interesting thing, same as Leanne said to me, is women don't like child molesters. They're all mothers in there, do you know? And they don't like having that guy around. Sorry, Jerry, go on, yeah?
No. One thing. Well, one side point is, that's revelatory what you're saying about him being able to see and shout to these people, because they've always maintained that they're totally separate. But possibly a bigger point is these people, these guys, let's call a spade a spade. They're deriving pleasure from the fact that they're in a women's prison.
Well, I don't know.
I would have assumed
Yes.
if they have a history of being predators, like the paedophile or whatever, like
Yeah.
no one can tell me that that isn't the case. But the other thing is, I guess all of this goes back to the passing of the Gender Recognition Act in 2015.
By the look of it, I think so. Yes, I think so. It happened. It happened on my watch, as a journalist, and I didn't see it coming. I didn't appreciate it, what was involved. And I think insofar as anybody discussed it at the time, say, that would never happen. No court would ever send a man to a women's prison. No court would ever send male sex offenders to a women's prison. My God, it's happened, hasn't it? It's but just if it takes the GRC, if we have to remove the GRC to get people like that out of women's spaces, well, then let's do it, But I think even if the GRC is still there, because legislation takes a long time to remove, please don't send any more of them there. I don't exactly know where Kardashian is now. My understanding is he's even at a greater remove than he was there last January. But should they go on, yeah? Mm-hmm.
No, just to say, we keep using the name Barbie Kardashian to give him his given name, which is Gabriel Alejendro Gentile. Is this and he is 22 years of age, and that factors in my head as to the pictures of Barbie Kardashian. When I look at some of the imagery of the persona, it looks like somebody that's a lot older. And
he's 22. He's not particularly big. I don't know what the paedophile looks like. The other guy was a big man, the man who beat up the woman in who beat up the elderly woman in Rathmines. He's a man of average size, maybe average build. He's quite fat. And he's like, but he's a man. Everybody knows he's a man. When on day one, defense had tried to get the judge to rule that the jury would not be told about his previous history and they'd be told he was a woman. God knows how that would have worked out because the guy is sitting there, I mean,
So
it's a
did so is the legal argument there that your previous, not alone as your gender kind of wiped, your previous history as a man is also
Well, that's what
wiped
defense
as
was
well.
looking for. I don't know why, and the judge ruled against it. But I'm sure the jury aren't stupid. Like, they'd have been able to work it out for themselves that this man. And also, prosecution at one stage said to him, and when this threat to rape, you've got male genitalia, and he says, I hate my male genitalia. But to me, it would be a relevant fact that a man is obviously more capable of rape. It's a more real threat than if we tried to tell the jury that's a woman, that
Well,
go on, yeah.
well, even if we were to take what he says is true, the fact that he hates his male genitalia does not mean he won't use his male genitalia.
Well, that's right. And the victims are supposed to know this. I mean, look, it's the same old thing, isn't it? Like that I was abused there outside the criminal courts of justice in Dublin by a journalist there on Thursday for my bigotry against trans people. And she said, you're saying that they're all pedophiles or that they're all predators. No, nobody's saying that. Nobody's saying that all men are predators. Just all men should stay out of women's changing rooms, actually, and stay out of... It doesn't mean... And then, another friend was saying to me the other day about, it's a funny how women sometimes are prepared to make more allowances to be kind, whereas men have the good men protect women, Jerry. A good man, if he heard somebody like Kardashian or anybody saying, I'm going to shove it's appalling stuff, what was a broom handle into you, you or I, as good men, I'm a 67-year-old man with only one working arm, I still would damn well put my body in between that woman and him and say, no, you will not. That doesn't happen on my watch. Good men protect women. And as everybody knows that men are stronger than women. Everybody knows men have penises which are capable of using. No sane person. How did we ever get here, Jerry? That you and I are here as if we're some kind of...
Well, we're not. Like, we need to stop. I think, like, maybe the vista from the greater Dublin area is different to the west, but I would say 80-90% of the people down here would agree with everything you're saying there. Like, do you know what I mean? But quietly, like, they're not jumping up and down about it. But I think a lot of them, and to be honest, a lot of it's due to your work on this, that people even know about what was going on in prisons, because I didn't know what was going on in prisons until I stumbled across some of your work last year. So
Right.
that goes back to the mainstream media, and
Yes,
I'd like to get your take on, like, RTE's.
Yeah.
How is there a decision taken at a kind of an executive level within RT to say, look, we're on board with this ideology and we don't want to highlight anything that might derail the train?
Yes, I do think that seems to be the decision that's taken. Just to go back to you about the mainstream media, Tegan McGee, I've been telling people since I discovered it about 6 months ago, there is a prisoner is one of the alleged victims of Kardashian's threats. Nobody knew that. There was nothing in the mainstream media to say that a prisoner had been threatened. And we did have government ministers, at least one, and politicians saying that nobody has any issue about the presence of men in the prison. Well, actually now, and whether or not, okay, the jury has found him not guilty, but there's no secret that he did make highly sexualized threats against these women, including a prisoner, So that's there. And as you say, you heard about it through my work. We shouldn't have to go to the mainstream media should be reporting these things. And you're right, people don't know about it. People are saying to me, say, God, that's not true, is it? And but I think we're winning on this one now. The genie is coming out of the bottle, and Kardashian's shocking testimony has been, come into the public realm now, and that's there. As regards RTE, look, I got 40 good years in there, it was this gender thing was breaking, and funnily, my last 2 years in RTE, I left in January of 22. I had an accident in about February of 20. I slipped on ice going out to work early one morning, and I wrecked my arm, my right arm. It's never recovered. And I was actually off sick for the very first time in my life for about 3 or 4 months. But then COVID came. Um, I kept working, and I realized my arm's not coming back, And I ended up being taken off the time off work. First time in my life, I almost never took a sick day in 40 years. It was first time for any extended period. But COVID came along then, and that kind of put paid to my usual tactic. There was, for example, the visiting in the prison. There was there was only much more limited visiting and so on. And the courts and everything, nobody was allowed to crowd in. Any of the places I would have gone all became crowded. But RTE should have been covering these things. And you look, what happened was, I'm looking at Joe Duffy in particular, which has been a great public forum. Joe Duffy's phone-in program for the last 20 years. Like, at its best, that program has allowed the country to speak, there's things like that should be on Joe Duffy's program. People should be able to say, is it right that we're putting men into women's refuges? Is it right that we're putting men into women's prisons? It's absolutely not touched. Things like this SPHE thing, this children's education thing, I'm looking at stuff that I find horrifying. The minister, but it seems, and all the media are saying, oh, but that was never meant for children, which is strange credulity. But I was reading there that why is that not there on Joe Duffy's program? Now, what we had was 2 years ago, must be coming up to, no, it's about 18 months ago, that Joe did take on the gender thing for 2 or 3 days. And RTE got itself into trouble, which is what a good broadcasting company should do. It should get itself into trouble. And next thing, it was going to be called before the Oireachtas to explain itself. And I thought, I'm really looking forward to that, to see the Oireachtas making complete idiots of themselves and attacking RTE for doing its job. And then what happened? The Oireachtas said, oh, we'll wait for some complaint to work out. But meanwhile, the rest of the media just so wanted to get a dig into RTE. They said RTE gets off the hook. No, actually, it was the politicians got themselves off the hook with that one. But look, I wrote to Joe Duffy and I wrote to the program and I said, well done. This was very, very good to do that. But effectively, they have never returned to that.
Yeah.
And so it does seem to have worked. The chilling effect does seem to have worked. Look, we're looking at it. That's the children's education, sex education thing. I believe it's had something like, is it 600,000 views now or something like that? And it's not there in the mainstream media. Can I say, even that, I put up a tweet on Barbie Kardashian yesterday just about him wanting to use the broomstick, telling us that in the morning, and he got not guilty in the afternoon. That's got over 4,500 likes in the last 24 hours. I don't think I've ever. So it's out there. People care. People are interested. But why are these things happening on social media and in alternative media? Why did you have to know, for example, that a woman got beaten up in that hostel in Rathmines? There has been nothing ever on mainstream media to say that a woman got beaten up by a man who was put into a domestic violence refuge. You have to go to Jerry O'Neill's podcast or Paddy O'Gorman's podcast, or people who are online with various other publications. And so RTE is no worse than the rest of them, but mainstream media has really opted out. But like,
can I just jump in there, Paddy, with a question? Have you noticed? Like, I'd probably take a stronger view against RTE than that, but what I would say, and without like, the question I would ask is, have you noticed, do you think the pandemic had an effect in that in a sense on a society, but b also our media organizations. It seems to me, because I do agree with you, programs like, if you go back to Jerry Ryan, Joe
Yes,
Duffy,
yeah,
and 15, 20, 30 years ago, you would have got a lot more of the vox pop of what
yeah,
the average person on the street was thinking. Now it seems to me the only people like you were, you know, your unique talent uh, is of that interview, as an interviewer, of giving voice to the voiceless, or um, that seems to has disappeared altogether. And part of that means taking on the alternative view to the what might be the mainstream agendas that we might accept, whether it's today or 20 years ago. There doesn't seem to be that those voices in the mainstream anymore.
I agree with you about the pandemic, and I don't understand how that happened, but it does seem to have shifted things. Now, what happened during the pandemic, I say, in a way, it put me out of business. I started working on archive work or production work like I'd done always, but the Vox Pop was killed by it. Now, I used to use that. I made a series called Queuing for a Living back in the 80s. And at that stage, my justification for going out there was, look, about two-thirds of Irish people have telephones. About a third didn't, and I'm going out there with the Vox Pop because they couldn't ring Jerry Ryan or Gay Byrne and so on, all who did great work. I mean, Gay was a genius at using the letters and the phone calls of people, and a great producer he had in John Cadden. That's how Gay did it in the 80s. I think he shifted so much about broadcasting, about rooting it in the people rather than going through gurus. But we're back to now to the gurus again. As you say, the certain approved voices are there. Now, along came the mobile phone, changed all of that, but which made phones far more socially democratic. But like I was looking back, I did a series of archive programs with RTE. I'm looking at a program I made in Tala in 1989. I went to what was called the Deserted Wives Queue. It was a queuing program, for deserted wives benefit, as it was called. These days, people on social welfare don't tend to get married. They just have their babies and get the state straight there. There's a lot of objective reasons to not marry now, that it's much safer just to get your book rather than marry. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that is the way the system is, that you'd be a fool. A young woman would be a fool to get married, to have her babies. But one of the women there who'd been had a violent man, and the guards had helped her to get a telephone, among many other things, into her house for security reasons. One of the very few telephones in a whole housing estate. So that was the way back in the 80s. The telephone was
Hmm.
only like the better off two-thirds of the country. Most people did have telephones by then, but the poorest people did not have telephones. And so they were excluded from that dialogue. So I was trying to bring them in. Jerry Ryan was a master, obviously, with his ways of getting people in, and other people as well on the nighttime independent stations. You had people doing I can't think, Adrian Kennedy, people like that. Suddenly, all of these voices were there. And that's a very, very good thing. Now, obviously, when you put an awful lot of things up there, you get some rubbish, but you get very valuable things as well. And surely this was a good shift. Something happened in recent years, and the pandemic seems to have brought it about, that we've gone back to what it was actually John. It was actually John Cadden. I remember using the expression "guru broadcasting" to say he didn't want that for the Gay Byrne show. They wouldn't bring on people who were experts on things. It was the country talking to itself. Well, I think what Cadden would have called guru broadcasting is what we're going back to now, and which is a great loss. It's taken the vibrancy out of the airwaves. It's like oh, I might seeming to
Well,
perverse.
just on that point is what you might say. The
Mhm.
follow on from that is only gurus can have an opinion. Approved gurus can have any sort of opinion, not just on the airwaves, but on this increasingly, because of the advent of maybe technology and AI and
Uh-huh.
all this stuff, is that people are now kind of censoring themselves outside
Yes.
of those spheres as well. They're afraid, like when we ask ourselves the question, why is um why don't people know about the fact that men are being housed in female
Yes.
prisons? It's
Mhm.
because in a certain sense they don't want to know, or if they do know, they're afraid to talk about it, even amongst themselves, which you would have said in the 80s and
Yes.
90s, if they weren't being heard on the television or the radio, they were certainly being heard in other public spaces, whether it was a bar, a community club, a
Yeah.
GA club, or stuff like that.
Yes, it's shifted that way, and there is that fear. Look, I went out of my way to go and see a particular journalist who I've always liked, and I thought would tackle this about Limerick, and he's the guy. He's well able to do it. And I drove to his home in County Cork, and I went to see him, and I said to him, "Look, we really need to do this." And he said to me, "Paddy, that is absolutely toxic. It can't be touched." And there was this thing coming in to RTE. It reminded me of it recently. 2019. I do remember getting slapped down that when Leo Varadkar, who was Taoiseach, announced a thing called PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, to combat HIV. And I said, "What is this?" "Oh, we're going to invest 5 million a year giving healthy men a drug. And what that is so they don't get HIV, they won't have to use condoms." And immediately I said to myself, this is bloody weird, you know? And a well known actor who, when I wrote to him a few weeks ago, he says, "Please don't quote me," but he said to me, a well known gay man, he says to me, "Paddy, what this is doing is reversing the safe sex message of the last 30 years. Like, if you're a gay man, you're now going to get money, going to get a drug, which means you can put your penis wherever you like without protecting yourself." Well, as this well-known actor said to me, that's going to cause an explosion of STIs among gay men. 5 years later, what do we have? We have an explosion of STIs among gay men. But going back to it, I said to RT at that time, "I'll stand outside the George, a well-known gay pub in Dublin, for 2 days, or whatever it takes, and talk to them. What do you think about this new shift in combating whatever?" Because I know there's a lot of gay men think it's a bad idea. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I got called up by senior management, and he very nicely, the head of radio at the time, says to me, "Paddy, we just don't touch this."
Why?
That
Why do you think that? Just let me ask this question, because you
sacred case,
mentioned the journey.
LGBT sacred case, that we cannot touch anything to do with them. And we had the news at one. I had to sit there listening to RTE's news at one, Anya Lawler saying, "And now we have some very good news. There's some news here about a step that's not only going to save lives, but save money too." And I'm sure listeners didn't know what it was all about, but it was about PrEP and who is going to be getting PrEP. And the doctor she interviewed says, "Well, it's for people who identify as being at risk of HIV." What that meant was gay men. But that whole code, and it actually goes back 30 years. In a way, this media self-censorship, I saw it all 30 years ago with HIV AIDS when it became obvious to me. When I knew a lot of the drug addicts who were getting it, I was interviewing people very early on by the mid-80s, when it became painfully obvious to me, blindingly obvious, that this thing of we are all equally at risk and it does not discriminate was wrong. AIDS discriminates. It is concentrated in risk groups. And the proof of that the last 5 years is that pre-exposure prophylaxis isn't if it didn't discriminate, we'd all be getting it. No, it's gay men are getting it, you know? And I'm old enough to have worked as a journalist in Africa back in the 80s, before everything was called AIDS. And so I had a strongly critical position of the way things were being declared AIDS. And we're supposed to believe that tuberculosis is now always caused by HIV and all this kind of thing. Again, people actually, the shift in the use of language, if you just called it AIDS, you know, everybody, and the huge racism that was involved there, believing that somehow black people were somehow hugely more sexually active. And look, all you have to do is look in Ireland and see the kind of rates of STIs that are happening among white-skinned Irish people, heterosexual Irish people as well, although in particularly, whatever, we have no right to be looking down our nose at Africans. But this respectable nonsense about Africa keeling over with venereal disease, just, we weren't allowed to challenge it. And it reminded me, and I was put offside. It was a bad career move for me to take a dissenting position about HIV. You know, 30, 40 years later, you can say nobody, no sane person would now say AIDS doesn't discriminate. But it was a very, very, I was foolhardy in a way, but I've no regrets. You know, I'm
Hmm.
still blurted out. You know, they can't stop me now.
And
But the
it is,
whole go on, yeah.
when you take a misstep, or when you look back at something like that, your stance there in the HIV case, is that something that's kind of a direct thing, or is it something you kind of notice yourself being shoved out, or you're excluded from certain things. How does that
Yes,
manifest?
it was a bad career move. I felt a little. I heard Graham Linehan recently talking about the stance he's taken on the transgender thing. He said, "Look, this is terribly wrong. What's happening here?" And he called charge, and he ran out. And then he looks around him and he says, "Where is everybody?" You know. And I think he described. I mean, I was looking at the HIV thing 40 years ago and said, "This rubbish about Africa. They just make stuff up." You know. I fell out with UNICEF Ireland. I have no problem. You contact them if you like. They put on an advert like it was Ryan Tuberty and Liam Neeson. This is about 2009, I think, would look in the camera and say, every 6 seconds, a child in Africa is orphaned by AIDS. So I wrote to UNICEF Ireland and said, can you give me a reference for that? After toing and froing, they said, yeah, it's because there's 5 million AIDS orphans a year. Divide that with how many seconds there are in a year. Ergo, every 6 seconds. Well, where's the 5 million? Eventually, they said, we are now just stopping this conversation, you know. Melanie Bavard, it was, wrote the letter to me saying this is now ended, you know. But like it's a great word for it I learned called a woozle. That's one of those things that everybody thinks somebody else has evidence for, and everybody's chasing everybody else's cited references and so on. I've seen it happen so many times and so many things, but that's a woozle that somebody once said there's 5 million orphans a year. Then you divide it to give it a mock precision, do you know? Just briefly, another woozle that was around for years because I covered immigration was the 50,000 undocumented Irish in the USA. Taoiseach and Kenny said it, Tánaiste de Gilmore, everybody was saying it. Then Trump came to power, which is what, nearly 8 years ago. And it was, oh my God, what's going to happen to the 50,000? And I'm asking, sorry, where's your evidence for this 50,000? And it was just one of these woozles. It was far too high, I believe, that figure. And I covered illegal immigration to New York and Boston extensively in the 80s and 90s. But this is just a figure picked out of nowhere. And journalists saw another one was in the HIV thing that 14,000 Africans a day get infected with HIV. I remember Bertie Ahern saying that came from somebody saying 5 million a year and dividing it by 365, and you come up with 14,000. And it's this pseudo precision that goes on and on and on. And I'm sure I make the mistake myself. I take figures from other journalists and I think that they're true. But when a thing is close to you, you look at it, you know. And yes, you do get shoved out if you don't go along with it. It's somehow, and I wasn't particularly brave. I was foolhardy, but I say I have no regrets. And what unfortunately now with the LGBT thing and all of that, RTE and mainstream media is leaving itself behind by simply lying, calling Barbie Kardashian a woman, by simply lying, you know, talking about that other, say, very shocking case in the domestic violence center and saying it was a woman.
Well, that's potentially a massive issue, Paddy, because what you'd say is a lot of the people that you're meeting going in and out of prisons are, you know, even post prison, they have they may have a number of different kind of issues or addictions in their life, and they do end up in halfway houses or places like that. And if we have sex offenders identifying as women, and it's one thing them separating a prison, but it's quite another if they're being left out into society and the social welfare picks up where Department of Justice leaves off and says, oh, here's a halfway house, women's halfway house for you. Like, that is
unbelievable, isn't it? But I mean, it is happening. Obviously, it hasn't happened a lot, but it's happening a lot in the USA.
But they're rubber stamping the precedents here. Like, do you know what I mean?
We are. And it's a thing that I find, it's a thing I've realized now with the trans-identifying men. They really want to get into women's places because it's actually their validation that they want to get. Look, a real woman goes to a public toilet and it's not a euphoria. You simply go and use the toilet. It's totally mundane. These guys say, oh, I'm validated. Or one of the particularly weird things that I've noticed that they have is they love being treated misogynistically. It's their fantasy. Oh, the men treat me like, misogynistically. And I got drawn into a thing a couple of years back when I was naive. This woman claiming she had been sexually assaulted on public transport. that I was upskirted. Oh, the horror. And I had enough experience from my days reporting in courts to see those cases and what worked for the prosecution. Basically, take out your camera these days and take a photograph of these guys. This was sort of a guy I saw it in Athlone, actually, a fellow who had indecently exposed himself on a bus, and the woman had the presence of mind, took out her camera and whatever. That's only a few years back before Judge Hughes, who died since, sadly. He was a great judge. I thought a fine human being, But I got drawn into this saying what you need to use is cameras. Then I realized after a little while, this isn't a real case at all. This is a fantasy of one of these guys. And this is one of the things now, of course, they're all saying, oh, we're being subjected to violence. What they call violence is their fantasy. They love, that's why they want to be in rape crisis centers. It's their fantasy is to be brought in and said, oh, I've been raped, the horror, I'm not saying these things never happen, but it's a particular thing as I'm going into this feckin' cesspit, which I'm discovering now, is these guys' fantasies, which I used to believe was genuine. Also, like when they say that there's increasing violence against transgender people or hatred, what they mean is me or you saying something like, actually, you need a man and a woman to make a baby. That's not hatred,
Well, I would say they probably would even the fact that, like, I've kind of taken a decision on this today to call Barbie Kardashian he. Like, they would view the use of the word he as kind of a verbally violent act, probably.
That's right. Oh yeah. I mean, I've had politicians saying I'm spreading hate. I have journalists saying I'm spreading hate. My God, what? For calling them he, or for having women explain what it's like when you're stuck literally next door to a sex offender. Thank you, Barbie, for making all of that so clear. That those women are between two sex offenders, literally either side. That they had the paedophile one side, Barbie another side. That was on E-wing. I hope it's changed now. I think it probably has. But like,
well, I would say it's definitely going to, as a result of your work and your dedication to covering the courts aspect and the jails aspect, it's brought it to light, even though it's not on a platform the size of RT, but it's been a significant light,
yes,
I think.
I know. And in the end, people saying to me, oh, if you really care about domestic violence and all that, well, actually I do. But they are right about one thing. There's a bigger issue here, is the right for people to be able to say this is happening. And that's where the gurus want to control the narrative now. And that's why they're calling what I do, and I'm sure what you do, hate speech now. That I never thought of myself as a rebel, particularly in any way. You just do your job. A journalist's first job is to tell what's going on, to tell the public what's going on. That's the sacred duty of a journalist, not to make the world a better place. And yet I'm finding myself in collision with the powers that be now, in a way. I'd never thought at this stage of my life, I'm 67, I never thought that I would be up against this, this kind of thing. It's all new.
Well, I probably think it probably it might stem, maybe, see how I feel about this, I suppose your interest is, and if I think of my interest is normally stemmed by my curiosity, and my curiosity kind of brings me down whatever path I go down to discover and ask questions about this thing I'm curious about. And that curiosity demands that you follow whatever you find. Like, do you know what I mean?
That's right. It's great.
And I do think the corporate and I would describe RT now nearly as the corporate media as well, most definitely, is that curiosity. They don't want it too much if it's not on point. But B, a lot of the way journalism is taught, and maybe it's academic, it's an academic pursuit now, through the college system. That doesn't seem to be coming through with people that are graduating and then going on to become members of our mainstream media.
Yeah, I think so. That now in my day, even most journalists, most people in the production in RTE were university graduates. Not all were, but it's
You're an you're a UCC man, a proud
Yes, I am.
UCC
Yeah,
graduate.
yeah.
English and history, I know. What's your sense of the university sector in Ireland as it relates to
Well,
journalism?
well, let's see. I did my leaving cert 50 years ago, and I went through university in 3 years, so it's like a half century ago. But it frightens me now, from what I can see of it. That
Mm.
it's and yet the universities do populate the broadcasters and the NGOs and all the rest of it. But I'm frightened when I see, for example, what's in Trinity College, Richard Dawkins being cancelled for one, and isn't it extraordinary? One of the voices most against Richard Dawkins being cancelled was David Quinn, formerly the Irish Catholic. Now, so one of the world's most famous atheists gets cancelled, and it's an Irish Catholic, David Quinn, who jumps to the defense of free speech. And I'm finding myself with more in common now with the Catholic Church, things like that, than I once would have done because of this. I'm finding myself um,
In
that
weird alliances,
in
possibly.
weird alliances, yes, or fundamentalist Christians and so on. Not that I've got religious, I'm not religious, but I actually do deeply care that people should be free to learn and not have it be prevented from hearing about certain things. So the universities do seem to be going backwards. I mean, safe spaces, I'll tell you, I never grew up in a safe space. One of the most formative things in my life, I think, is having a slightly English accent growing up in Ireland. That's the thing you get mauled by. And school was not a safe space for me. University was not a safe space for me, because at that time it was sort of universally apartheid would end and it would be Brits out of the north. And I was a two nationist, and I still am. I could see your eyes widening there. That we were a horrifying people. But you have to my mind, the reason the Good Friday Agreement has had the success it has is because it recognizes there are two sides to this. Time
Mm.
and again, it was very, very simple. But my slightly English accent made it seem, well, he's a Brit anyway. But I could just see there was a uh, I thought there was just assumed that somehow or other, push the Brits out and the Prods would come to heel. We never even studied the history of Ulster, the Ulster custom and the whole settlement and all the rest of it. Other than this was a bad thing that happened to Ireland. We ended up with two different national, I would say two nations. We ended up with two different national alignments in Ireland. And yet I find myself now on the same side on many things as, say, Aontu, which would be the conservative wing of Sinn Féin, which I never thought would happen in my life. But Aontu are saying the things that others wouldn't. I canvassed for Jim Kemmy back in 1977. He became chairman of the Labour Party, but
Yeah.
he would have been the arch two-nationist in his day. But socialism
But
at that time was very tied into. Sorry, I
well, what
haven't
would you?
spoken.
I'm just when you mentioned the word Jim Kemmy, it's such a blast from the past. But
Yes,
I'm
yes.
trying to square how Jim Kemmy would feel about Ivana Bacik being the leader of the Labour Party today.
No, I mean, Ivana is in my area. I did vote for her in the by-election. And because look, I would traditionally have been a Labour voter. I won't be this time on the present reckoning because they have disappointed me so much on the hate speech thing, the transgender thing. I had a Labour councillor canvassing, and one of her team. This happened only about 3 months ago. One of her team saw me, and I'm with my grandchildren, two small grandchildren, and the guy started abusing me, shouting, "You're a danger to trans people." And of course, I couldn't answer him when I have two small kids with me. That counsellor came to my door more recently, and I said to her, I didn't like the way that person was shouting at me. And she claimed not to know who he is, but he's a man of very distinctive appearance. But I'll say it to Ivana if she comes to my door. With the greatest respect, I will say to Ivana why I'm not going to be voting for her this
Where do you
time.
think the Labour Party have kind of disappeared in my I'm just thinking back to the council and European elections. Now I know. Where do you think the Labour Party stand coming into this general election that's imminent?
Yeah,
It's going to be announced any day now.
yeah. Well, they're not in a good place. On the other hand, really, now that there is no opposition, Sinn Féin has not I wrote a piece on this recently. Like they go anywhere. Sinn Féin used to have a neutral position on abortion, but because I worked in Britain and the USA a lot in the 80s and 90s, I was always fascinated by they were left wing in Britain and they were conservative in the USA.
But sure, they had
Because
two, like there was a period of time in the early COVID period where they had two different policies. The Northern Sinn Féin
yes,
and the Southern Sinn Féin were supporting two entirely different
that's
set of
it's
COVID
exactly and
policies.
precisely true now, Jerry. That
Yeah.
when the British government puberty blockers ban came in, temporary bans meant to be still after the Cass report in Britain about giving kids these things too young because of their permanent effects, or supposed permanent effects, which Cass found. I expect she's right. So the Starmer, the Labour government came in Britain, they extended that. So then suddenly the Northern Ireland executive had to decide what it was going to do. So First Minister O'Neill and First Minister and Deputy First Minister Pengele, these two women were faced with this. Pengele had no problem. She would support the British government, the Labour government on this. Sinn Féin is dedicated to an affirmative healthcare thing. So what did they do? Unceremoniously, they pivoted on their puberty blocker policy, just like that. And you had the transgender activists quite rightly saying, were you not serious then about this? And I could have told them, seasoned Sinn Féin watchers like myself could have told them all along, no, they're not serious about this, lads. You know, that's but what's extraordinary, and I wrote to Sinn Féin about this, I've had no reply. I've written to Mary Lou McDonald, I've had no reply, saying, can you explain, please, how, on the basis of what you consider the same medical advice, you support puberty blockers in the Irish Republic and you're against the using puberty blockers in Northern Ireland? And we know it's simply what is politically safe. The welfare of children has nothing to do with it, or what they judge to be politically the most pragmatic thing to do. That's why they were silent on abortion in the 80s. They're now claiming they were pro-abortion in the 80s. No, they were not. They said nothing on the Eighth Amendment, nor did they have to. But it was Martin McGuinness. So I remember attending their Ardèche in '86 as a journalist, and he says, we are not a single issue party. I think 40 years on, they actually do show themselves to be a single issue party. And that's why they're slipping down the lines. They were every populist position you could possibly take. I mentioned pre-exposure prophylaxis earlier, and I was looking, and next I see Mary Lou McDonald's name. Mary Lou McDonald's committed Sinn Féin to pre-exposure prophylaxis must be available. Nobody really knows about that. If it became publicly known, though, this is to facilitate unsafe sex between gay men, Sinn Féin would drop that policy just as quickly. They're a non-existent party outside of it, and the public have seen through that now, I think, and that's why they're slipping. So I would really like to see a Labour opposition. I would like to see where are they going. So, like, Labour might rebuild itself. But I just, at the moment, I'm appalled at the hate speech thing and their failure to commit themselves to free speech, and that one, and also the fact that they will not take up. And look, I was walking my dog there one day, and I met Ivana Bacik because she walks her dog in the same park as I do, Sondra Park in Crumlin there. And I said to her, I'm doing a podcast, and I said to her about the transgender thing, and would you mind listening to it? And she said she would, but then she referred me to Labour's transgender policy, and it's appalling. I mean, it's affirmative, affirmative, affirmative. I haven't actually seen Ivana Bacik since then, but so when you ask me where's Labour going to go, and in a way, there's a gap there in the opposition. I think a plausible, thoughtful left-wing opposition may actually emerge. And people say
Well,
to
I
me,
think there's definitely, if I
there's
was to
room
sum
for
it
it.
up, there's definitely room for a proper, authentic anti-establishment party, because most of what I would say about Labour, Sinn Féin, and the government parties is they're all much of a muchness. They're all kind of
At the moment.
establishment
You're
at
right.
the
And we
moment.
saw that in the referendums, didn't we? The two referendums. It
Yeah.
was extraordinary that the three parties of government, and I think the four main parties of opposition, Sinn Féin, Labour, People Before Profit, and the Greens. No, sorry, the Greens are in, in government, but they were all anti, or they were all pro this. And despite the fact of all the the main parties of government, all three parties of government, all the main parties of opposition, all were going the one way. And we, the people, including myself, voted heavily the other way. That surely leaves a gap, doesn't it? The trouble with independence, it's like herding cats, isn't it? And but who knows where the vote
But who
might
knows
go.
where goes? But one final question, Paddy, and
Yes,
this
of
is
course.
more of a personal question, because you mentioned earlier you're kind of get retired and using the free travel, and
Yeah.
but I still see the big passion in you to to go to these places to
Yes.
investigate. Your curiosity doesn't seem to be waning, your energy doesn't seem to be waning. Have you got a certain sense of freedom
Yes.
through doing your
Yes.
podcasting?
Yes, I have. Yeah. No, look, I'm not blaming RTE for this. I understand that RTE was a broadcaster, semi-state. You had to stay neutral on things. I always accepted those rules, although I could name people there who are quite one-sided now. For example, on this SPHE thing, that RTE is not remaining objective at this stage. RTE is very much a one side. But yes, it does give me a freedom now that I don't have to worry, that I can do stuff and I know it won't be spiked by some career-minded producer, that because I'm in charge of that. Also, look, you don't have the same imperative like I had to get, say, when you're in working life, you have deadlines. I don't have the same deadlines now, and I fully accept deadlines. That's what you're paid for. But it doesn't really matter. I just put up a podcast literally about 2 minutes before I came on the air with you, but I'd been working on it the last few days, the edits. It's now gone live, my most recent podcast. It's continuing on at the criminal courts of justice, but so yeah, there is that freedom, and I'm enjoying that. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
no,
I
that's
still have
good.
fire in me.
Look, Paddy, we'll leave it at that, and hopefully
Great.
we'll chat again in the future, now that we're
Okay.
broken bread, as it were.
All right, Jerry. The best of luck with
Okay,
everything.
thanks a
Really good
million for your
talking
time.
to
I
you.
really appreciate it. Now I'll just end the recording there, folks.